Good day, everyone. My name's Arvin J. Gamutan.
My name is Sharamay Baez.
I am Crystalline Escabarte.
My name is Rosen Sicolatis.
I'm Anthony Humamil.
I am Leslie Cloma.
And we are the Group 5.
Today, we will be discussing the interview and observation in thesis writing. So one of the methods in research is the interview. The interview is one of the major techniques in data or information gathering. It is defined as purposeful face-to-face relationship between two persons, one whom is the interviewer who asks the questions, and the other one is the interviewee who will answer the questions. This is done to gather information and other code the interviewee or respondent who supplies the information asked for. Just like any research methods, interview has also its purposes and uses. The first one is that the researcher may approach and interview knowledgeable people to gain insights for his problem. The variables he is going to use, the formulation of specific questions and hypotheses, the statistical methods he is going to utilize, and others. Second, the researcher may also interview people with background knowledge that could also help his study. The researcher may use questionnaire or ask about the proper construction and validation of questionnaire, or who can make any contribution to the enrichment of his study. Third, the interviewer may also wish to gain information from overt, oral, physical, or emotional reactions of the subject towards certain questions. In which cases, when the subject of the study is a person with some signs of abnormality, the interviewer may use or gain information from the overt or oral, physical, and emotional reactions of the subject towards certain questions to be used for possible remedy of the abnormality. Fourth, the researcher may also use the interview as a principal tool in gathering data or just to supplement data from other techniques for his study. Just like any research methods, interview has also its own advantages and disadvantages. Let's tackle first the advantages of the interview. First, it yields a more complete and valid information. The respondent is usually pressed for an answer for a question which the interviewer can validate at once. He can probe into the veracity of the reply immediately. Hence, there is a higher proportion of usable returns. Second, the interview can be used with all kinds of people, whether literate or illiterate, rich or poor, laborer or capitalist, and etc. Third, the interviewer can also clarify points or questions which are vague to the interviewee. Fourth, only the interviewee respondent can make replies to questions of the interviewer, unlike in case of a questionnaire in which filling up a questionnaire may be delegated to another person to answer, or the respondent may be added by another person in making replies. Fifth, the interviewer can observe the non-verbal reactions or behavior of the respondent, which may reveal rich pertinent information. These are subliminal cues, which are behavioral or attitudes that are not specifically stated but are covertly displayed. They include inflections in the voice, manner of speech, such as how hesitant the speakers are and how much enthusiasm they display when they speak, manner in which they sit on a chair, activity, and all other behaviors that you may be able to observe directly. The interviewer must be skillful in reading cues. He may bring such subliminal cues to the attention of the respondent to check if his suspected recognition is correct and alleviate tension. Interpretations and predictions based upon nonverbal cues must be accurate, otherwise they will tend to be biased subjective data. 6. Greater complex questions can be asked with the interviewer around to explain things. Greater complex data which are vital to the study can be acquired. 7. There is flexibility. The interviewer can effect a modification of the interview or any question if there is a need so that the desired information can be gathered. Now let's go to the disadvantages of the interview. The first disadvantage is that there are instances wherein respondents are hard to contact or cannot be contacted at all. It may be because of the distance or their place or due to some other reasons. For instance, if a selected respondent is in another country, it can be hard to contact him. Second disadvantage would be it is expensive if there is a need to hire interviewers just to meet a target date. The cost of training them and their salaries would entail too much expenses. Third, the responses may be inaccurate. It could be that the interviewee has no time to consult his records immediately and he could just answer the questions in the questionnaire just as is, just to meet the target time to pass it to the interviewer. Fourth, it is time consuming. It is time consuming if only the researcher conducts the interviews. So basically, a researcher may need another person to assist him in the interviews. Fifth, it is inconvenient for both the interviewer and the interviewee in terms of time and sometimes in terms of place. It could be that the interviewer has to travel from one location to another just to meet his interviewee. Six, there is no anonymity and so the interviewee may withhold some confidential but vital information. If the information may possibly invite trouble. It could also be that the interviewee may withhold information because the information is about the morality of an individual or the commission of graft and corruption. Seventh, there is a tendency of interviewers to introduce bias because they may influence their interviewees to give replies that would favor their researcher employers. This may happen in political surveys where the candidacy of a certain person is involved. Eighth and last disadvantage of the interview is if the interviewer modifies a question, the standardized construction of the question is lessened and categorization and tabulation becomes a problem.
Now, let's move on and let's talk about the different types or classes of interview. So this is according to Tres and Tres Juniors. It is being stated that there are 5 classification of interviews. What are these? So first is standardized interview. The second one is non-standardized interview. The third one is semi-standardized interview. The fourth is focus interview. And the last classification of interview is what is so-called non-directive interview. So let's begin to talk about the first classification of interview, which is the standardized interview. So what is standardized interview all about? So in this type of interview, the interviewer is not allowed to change the specific wordings of the questions in the interview schedule. He must conduct the interview in precisely the same manner. He cannot adapt to questions for some specific situations or pursue statement in order to add something in the data. So to wrap up in this type of interview, this is what we so-called formal interview. So the next is non-standardized interview. So what is non-standardized interview and how it differs from the first classification of interview, which is the standardized interview? So in this type of interview, the interviewer has a complete freedom to develop each interview in the most appropriate manner for each situation. So he is not held into any specific questions. He may revise, he may add to, or subtract from the interview schedule. Depends on which he thinks is the best for the situation. And this is what we so-called informal interview. The third classification is semi-standardized interview. So what is semi-standardized interview all about? So semi-standardized interview, in this type of interview, the interviewer is required to ask several major questions. And beyond this, he is free to prove as he chooses. So there are prepared questions to be asked. And once these are asked and being answered, the interpreter is required to ask any question as he sees fit for the situation. The fourth classification of interview is what we so-called focused interview. So what is focused interview? Focused interview is also called as deep interview. So this kind of interview is somehow related and similar to the second classification of interview, which is the non-standardized interview. So there were no specific questions to be asked by the interviewer. The researcher asked the respondents or the interviewee, and depends on his understanding or on his insight about the subject matter. So a specific question or specific attention is given to specific topics or ideas. So the purpose of this interview, so the purpose of this type of interview is to focus on the specific ideas or topics that is in need to be investigated in depth. So it's also being stated that the interviewer also can direct his question in order for him to discover the backgrounds and the experiences also that has influence in the subject. So to give you an example, in counseling, this is what we so-called directive counseling or directive questioning. This is to prove the motives, the thoughts, and also the problems of the counselee. And the last classification of interview is what we so-called non-directive interview. So what is non-directive interview? Non-directive interview, in this type of interview, the interviewee or the respondent is given an opportunity to speak. So they done the most talking of this type of interview. So there were no pressure of the interviewer and they are not waiting to be questioned. So it is free from disapproval. So to give you an example, in clinical interview used in psychotherapy is non-directive. So the purpose of non-directive is to get a comprehensive picture of the motives, the thoughts, and also the values of the subject. So the problem here is how to make the respondent or the subject talk. And also, the question used can affect their point of view. So that is all based from the classification of interviews of Tres and Tres Jr. Now let's move on. Let's take a look at the illustration being presented. So this is based on Manuel and Midel. So there are three classifications as shown. First is structured interview. The second one is semi-structured interview. The third one is unstructured interviews. And when we say structured interview, somehow related and similar to standardized interview. And the semi-structured, somehow related and similar to semi-standardized interview. And the third, which is unstructured, is similar to non-directive interview. So, on the other hand, Good and Scales also propose their point of view about the classification of interview. So, there are four. First is according to function. When we say according to function, it could be for diagnostic interview, treatment interview, research interview, or it could for gathering research data in general. The second is according to the number of persons participating. So when we say according to the number of persons participating, it could be individual interview, group interview, or those person who is being interviewed simultaneously by the same interviewer. The third is according to the length of contact. So when we say according to the length of contact, it could be short contact or a long contact. And the last is the relation or assumed relations of the interviewer and the interviewee in relation to socio-psychological process of interactions. And it could be according to non-directive. Could be focused and also repeated interview. So when we say non-directive, it is unstructured, it is uncontrolled and unguided. When we say focused, it is directive interview. So when we say repeated interview, it is used to test the development of socio-psychological process. So that's all for classification, different types of interview from different personalities. Start from Tres and Tres Jr. to Manuel and Midel, and last for Good and Scales. Now let's talk about the instruments of interview. So what are the instruments of interview? So there are two. First is interview schedule, and the second one is interview guide. So when we say interview schedule, this has to be quite similar to questionnaire in a way that the process of preparing and validating is quite similar to the process of preparing and validating also in questionnaire. So what are the difference between the two? So in the former, the interviewer read the questions with the respondent for him. And the interviewer also is responsible to take down or to record everything that's been said by the interviewer, the subject. Unlike now, in which the interviewer give the questionnaire to respondent, and the respondent itself is responsible to read and to fill out the questionnaire without the aid of the interviewer. Now let's talk about what is interview guide. Interview guide does not go into details, but it only provides ideas, and it allows the interviewer to freely pursue relevant topics in depth. The items provide for flexibility of manner, order, and language of questioning. So, what are the difference between the two? The interview schedule is used when the researcher knows everything that is being included in the questions about the hypothesis or the specific questions. The interview guide is used when the researcher has a limited knowledge about the topics or information about the topics to be researched on, so that he needs a more proving for an in-depth investigation. So here is an example of an interview guide for gathering data. So this is all about the teaching of science in the high schools of Province A. So take a look. So as it's being presented, it includes name, which is optional. That is to observe the confidentiality. It also includes date, address, educational qualification, faculty, the methods and strategies of teaching, the facilities, supervisors' assistants, problems encountered in teaching, proposed solutions to problem, and implications to the teaching of science. So that's all for the instrument. Now let's talk about the steps in interview. This is what we so-called the pointers of interview. So first is planning step, or preparatory steps. Including the steps are the following. First is selection of the universe and the local of the study. The second is selection of the respondents by any valid sampling method. The third is selection of the type of interview, whether standardized, non-standardized, semi-standardized, focus, non-directive, or etc., depending upon the nature of the problem or topic of research. Then the last is preparation of the instrument, whether interview schedule or interview guide, and validating or testing, same. The second is selecting the place of interview. So when you select the place, it could be for guidance and counseling as well as psychiatric interviews. The interviewer can select a very ideal place for the interview. However, in research in general, the interviewer may be required to go to the dwelling places of the interviewees, or to their places of their work. So the important point is that the place of the interview should be as quiet and convenient as possible with the least possible distractions. It is very important in research. Avoiding distractions. And the third is establishing a rapport. So say establishing rapport, a cordial and friendly atmosphere must be established between the interviewer and the interviewee, of course, for them to convince also and for them to be at ease in answering your questions. The interviewer must introduce himself and his purpose as cordially and politely as possible. So you should always be polite. And if he has an ID, he should show it. So it could help proving that your intention is good and you cannot harm that person, or you cannot harm the interviewer, the subject of your study. So the importance of the interview to both the interviewer and the interviewee must be impressed upon the latter. So the latter may have some benefit from the interviewer study. If there is none, he must have the assurance that no harm may befall him. It must be explained to him that the information he will supply will be kept as confidential. So this is very important as possible, and there will be a complete anonymity for him. He must be assured that nothing will place him in any compromising, embarrassing situation. So this is one way for the interviewer to get the trust of the interviewer, the subject for his study. And the fourth is carrying out the interview. So carry out the actual interview in politely, friendly, and conversational manner. Praise and thank the respondent for any important or vital comments worthy of mention. If respondent is unable to express himself for lack of knowledge of some technical items, the interviewer may help him out, but the interviewer must maintain his objectivity, so to prevent bias. So the interviewer must also be very tactful. If the interview exhibits some signs of annoyance or hostility in the interviewer, mature all his resourcefulness to quiet down the nerves of the respondent, to make him cope natural again. If he refuses to answer, do not force or do not press him hard to make one wait a little, or later he may give in. So explain to him that any information he may give will be kept strictly confidential. So this is very important also when your study is very crucial. Like for example, rape victim, or like for example, murder. The fifth is all about recording the interview. So, record the interview immediately but objectively. So, record exactly what has been said by the respondent, any of his non-verbal expressions shown be overtly, but do not include interpretation yet. Like, for example, when you said, he smiled, not he was pleased. And it is much better if you will use tape recorded. And last step is closing the interview. So close the interview with the expression of gratitude and thankfulness, most especially for the information obtained and for the time sacrificed by the interviewee or the subject. Make him feel that he has played an important part for the completion of your study. So that's all for the steps in the interview.
What to avoid during interviews. So these are the things that may spoil an interview and should be avoided. The first one is avoid exerting undue pressure upon a respondent to make him participate in an interview. Why is that? Because when a respondent or participant is being forced or pressured by the interviewer, there is a tendency that they will not give a reliable answer, and there will also be doubts whether to give that information or not. And as an interviewer, you must make sure that they are willing to participate in your interview for you to have reliable answers. The second one is avoid disagreeing or arguing with or contradicting with the respondent. As an interviewer, you must be patient and understand to what their point is. Contradicting with them is another way of not letting them express their opinions. At some point, there is a tendency that they will be irritated and not give you some vital information if you keep on disagreeing with them. So the third one is avoid unduly pressing the respondent to make reply. As an interviewer, you must not force them to give a response because some might give answers just for compliance, and we don't want that for the results of our study. And no one wants to receive an information that is unreliable. You must wait for them to give the reply and be patient. So the fourth one is avoid using a language well over and above the ability of the respondent to understand. The interviewer must consider the respondents and must make sure that they understand what they are up to. You must consider the language that they are using to have a connection with them, because if the respondent does not understand you very or does not understand the language very well of the interviewer, then the former gives wrong information or he may not report at all. So the fifth one is avoid talking about irrelevant matters, because talking about irrelevant matters will only prolong the interview, and it would be a waste of time for the interviewer and as well as to the interviewee. Focus on what the topic is all about, because not everyone is patient, so you as the interviewer should adjust. The sixth one is avoid placing the interviewee in embarrassing situations. Okay, so regardless of what topic you are dealing about, as a researcher, we must be sensitive enough to handle different topics, especially when it comes to morality, integrity, or sexual habits. Because if you are showing them insensitivity, that is against ethics, and as a person, we must respect their confidentiality. So number 7, avoid appearing too high above the respondent in education knowledge and social status. This will only make the interviewee very shy. There's a tendency that they will not tell you all the information that you will ask. You must, as the interviewer, you must blend in with them in order to have a connection with them. You must blend in with them and make sure that they are comfortable with you. There are people who can easily be intimidated by other people. That is why we need to control ourselves in dealing with the respondents. So the last thing that should be avoided during an interview is avoid interviewing the respondent in an unholy hour. So we must avoid this, especially when they are too busy handling other important matters. We must consider their time. We should be the one to adjust with them. So those are the things that should be avoided during an interview. I hope you guys learned something, and thank you guys for listening. Okay. So the next topic will be observation. So in this part, I am going to tackle about the definition of observation, the types and the purposes of it. So next slide, observation, the definition, purpose, and types. So what is observation? According to the book, observation as a means of gathering information for research may be defined as perceiving data through the senses, which are sense of sight, hearing, taste, touch, and smell. So the most commonly used sense is the sense of sight, obviously because we observe through our eyes, using our eyes. So observation is one of the methods for collecting research data. It involves watching a participant and recording relevant behavior for later analysis. So the observation method has the advantage of providing direct evidence of the phenomenon that is being studied. Okay, so let's proceed to the purpose of observation. So why do you guys think observation is necessary, especially in the field of research? So today I'm gonna tackle about the reasons why observation is important. So the first one is to enable the researcher to gather empirical data which are difficult to obtain by other means. So example of this is anthropological studies. So a researcher will gather an information or data from a certain tribe or a group. Example of the data are life cycle, motivations, aspirations, or other practices of that group, and the data that will be collected through observing or observation can be a great help to the study or the research, because the data can be explained in detail or can be described in detail. So the second purpose of observation is to enable the researcher to gather sufficient data to supplement or verify information gathered by other means. So for instance, a survey questionnaire that is rich of information gathered from the respondents, but it is different from ocular inspection or the observation through the sense of sight, because ocular inspection, it may verify or support this claim to be true or untrue, and there can be additional information that may also be gathered. So the third purpose of observation is to enable the researcher to gather information to describe the aspect of variable. So example of this is case studies. Case studies wherein observation of the subject is a vital tool in gathering data that may support the study or the research. So the fourth purpose of observation is to enable the researcher to gather directly primary data. So here it is beneficial for the researchers because that data that has been gathered is collected directly from the main source, and that is regarded as the best kind of data a study could have. So the fifth and last purpose of observation is to enable the researcher to gather data from the laboratory or elsewhere through experimentation. So here it is given already that results from the experiments are correct. Data gathered through it are accurate, valid, and reliable because the variables involved here are under the rigid control of the experimenter. So those are the 5 purposes of observation. Let's now proceed to the types of observation. Okay, so there are 3 types of observation. Number 1, participant and non-participant observation, structured and unstructured observation, and the last one is controlled and uncontrolled observation. The first type of observation is participant and non-participant observation. In participant observation, the observer takes active part in the activities of the group being observed. So here, the investigator may disguise himself as someone who is part of the group just to be accepted as a participant observer. So as we have noticed, when someone is observing us, we tend to not show them the real us and tend to change our behavior. That is why when the observer becomes one of the members, their behavior and responses are least likely to be affected. So in the non-participant observation, the observer is a mere bystander observing the group. So unlike the participant observation, he does not participate in any activities of the group, but his job is to just observe. So the second type of observation is structured and unstructured observation. Structured observation concentrates on the aspects of the variable being observed. So here, structured observation is when the items to be observed are usually specified. Sample of this is it could be a thing, a behavior, condition, or situation of a certain subject. This is usually used in one participant or controlled observation. So the second one is the structured observation. The observer does not hold any list of the items to be observed. So basically, this is the opposite of the structured observation, wherein the observer doesn't hold any list of the thing that he or she will observe. It could be anything. It could be an object, it could be a behavior, a condition of a certain subject too, as long as it can be helpful to the researcher and to the study. This is usually used in participant or non-controlled observation. So the last type of observation is controlled and uncontrolled observation. So in controlled observation, it is usually utilized in experimental studies in which the experimental as well as non-experimental variables are controlled by the researcher. So both are controlled by the researcher. So in the experimental variable, it is manipulated by the experimenter for it to produce an effect or a behavior upon the dependent variable, while the non-experimental variables are kept constant. It will not be manipulated by the researcher or equal in all aspects, so that if any change may occur, it is attributable only to the independent variable. So the second one is uncontrolled observation. It is usually utilized in natural setting. So basically, this observation doesn't include any manipulating from the researcher. No control whatsoever is placed upon any variable within the observation area. So example of this is an office worker. The worker may be observed as they work in their office and how they communicate with their co-workers and the customers. That is a natural setting. So uncontrolled behavior is like unstructured observation, and it is utilized in participant observation. So those are the definition, the purpose, and types of observation. I hope you learned something, and thank you for listening.
am Rosa Ancicalares, and this is my topic, the advantages and disadvantages of observation. Let's move on to the advantage of observation. It is the investigator is able to gather directly first-hand information about the subject of his study. This kind of information is more accurate, more valid, and more reliable than any information gathered through other things or means. Second, the researcher can observe his subjects for as long as he needs the time, as many times as he can, for greater accuracy and validity. It is for description and interpretation. Third, observation is a superior technique for collecting information from nonverbal behavior and inanimate objects. The observer is a good position to discern the significance of an inanimate object or a nonverbal behavior. Fourth, the subjects of the inquiry can be observed in their natural settings, and this will include artificiality, its descriptions, and interpretation. This is especially through participants and uncontrolled and unstructured observations. Let's move on to the disadvantages of observation. First, in observation, in natural settings, there is a lack of control upon extraneous variables, which may adversely affect the validity of attributing certain causes upon certain effects. Example, in farming. For instance, an increase in production may be attributed to the use of fertilizer. But there are factors to be involved such as water management, eradications of pests, or others. Second, there is smaller size of sample if the universe covers a very wide area and the researchers cannot afford to be observed a substantial area. This makes descriptions and interpretation less accurate and less valid. Manang gamit ang validity ani ninja. Third, it is difficult to quantify data for standard tabulation, especially in unstructured observations and when recording is done in the AC form. And fourth, sometimes it is hard to gain entry into the area to be observed. This is true if the research problem is as sensitive or controversial, such as nude colonies or prostitutions ang imong studihan. Then number 5, lack of anonymity makes the observed subjects withdraw or keep secret from some vital but sensitive and controversial information. For example, are in the graft and corruption. This subject is very secretive. That's all.
Hello everyone, we are done with the advantages and disadvantages of observation. Now let us proceed to the characteristics of observation for research purposes. There are 6 characteristics. First is observation is specific. When we say it's specific, it's not broad nor general. It is not just looking around for general aspect of human behavior. Rather, it is directed at those specific aspects of total situation which are assumed significant. And also, you must be a keen observer to small things and carefully define those things to look for because you might miss important information or data. The second one is observation of behavior for research purposes is systematic. It is not haphazard or unplanned. There must be a system, a method, and planning to conduct an observation, not a chance of dropping in on a situation at any time. Di siya pinakalit. It includes the length of observation period, the interval between them, the number of observation, the area or situation of observation, and so much more. The third one is observation is quantitative. It usually with a tally of number of instances a particular type of behavior has occurred, or it can be the total duration of the conduct during the period of observation. Sometimes a diagram is made to show spatial relationship for us to have a better understanding. The fourth one is observation is recorded immediately. During observation, it is difficult to remember each element of observation or to remember information or data. So, record is made of the observation immediately or as promptly as possible. We do not entrust the result to memory because it can be mixed up with another memory or another experience, and also we might forget important information if we don't jot down or record the observation immediately. Next, number 5, observation is done by an expert. The one conducting the observation is an expert, that is, done by an investigator who is trained for such work. They have gone thorough training, seminars for them to be knowledgeable about it. The difference between observational skill of an investigator who is trained and to the person that is not trained is sufficient in itself, in the investigator himself, to make difference between valid and invalid results, to know which are valid and invalid results. The last one is observation results can be checked and verified. The result of systematic observation can be checked and verified by comparing the results of different observer, if to know if the behavior has occurred to another observer, the same with what you have, or by repeating the observation. So those are the 6 characteristics of observation for research purposes. After knowing the characteristics of observation, we then go to recording the results of observation. Results of observation should be recorded immediately, as what I have stated earlier. There are forms for recording the results of observation. The first one is a checklist, second one is a rating scale, third one is anecdotal forms, fourth one is mechanical recording, and the fifth one is stenographic recording. The checklist. A checklist is a device which contains items to be observed and a space for a number or check marks or short verbal entries. It is categorized into 3. A. Checklist with short verbal entries. The items to be observed are listed down to be followed by a short verbal description of each item. As you can see in the figure, this is an example of a checklist in physical education. B. Checklist that indicates the presence and the absence of an item. In the figure, this is an example of a checklist for observation in farming, wherein the observer must put check or yes to the space provided if the item is present, and no or leave the space blank if the item is absent. C. A dichotomous checklist. We all know that die means 2, so in this checklist, there are only 2 possible answers. It can be yes or no, or present or absent. In the figure, the observer must place a check mark in the space under yes if the item is present, and place a check mark under the no if the item is not true. How to design a checklist? There are steps in construction of a checklist that includes 1. Enumerate or list down the dimension or factors to be observed in your checklist. The second one is define them very clearly and also in a simple language. And it is difficult to explain complex matters, so you must be able to know what they are exactly. Third one is eliminate those that are vague, which is not clearly expressed or have indefinite meaning, or eliminate those that are repetitive or having a repetition of unnecessary item. The fourth one is arrange them on a sheet of paper in a manner most convenient for observing and recording, so that it won't be difficult for you to observe and that all of the items are napahilo na. After arranging them, include a space for identifying data. This is the blank or the space that is intended for the information or the data, as what I have showed in the figures earlier. Next, the sixth one is try out the form. In this, you will be able to know the errors and also to determine the mistake in your checklist. After trying it out, you must revise the form on the basis of the tryout and your experience in order for your checklist to improve and to be better. Number 8. Write the checklist in its final form. This is the final step of designing a checklist. Then, after having the final form, you can now conduct an observation. The second one in recording the results of observation is a rating scale. A rating scale is a checklist with an evaluation standard. The types of rating scales are numerous, but some may be given. In this figure, this is an example of a graphic rating scale. It indicates the answer options on a scale of 1 to 5 in a 5-point rating scale. Likert scale, as we all know, is one of the popular examples of this. In the figure, the observer must put check mark in the column that best describes the activity of the students being observed. He will put check mark in always, very often, usually, or seldom. The second example is an example of numerical rating scale. It has numbers as answer options. The observer must choose the phrase or statement that describe best the behavior or activity of the student being observed, and he will write number beside the phrase in the space provided, as you can see in the figure. Number of categories or subdivisions of scale. The number of categories of subdivision for a rating scale is indeterminate. It is not exactly known, established, or defined. In practice, the usual number is 5, but there is no rational justification to that. The 1 to 5 scale or 5-point rating scale. The maximum number is 7, but again it cannot be justified. And the minimum number is 2. One example of this is the dichotomous rating scale. 10 is unusual categories. So those are the number of categories or subdivision for scales.
Let's move on to the next topic, the anecdotal forms. It is a checklist that provides our less breakdown for dimensions or factors, but it needs much space for writing. It minimizes the use of the highly subjective impressions in recording and obtains instead an objective descriptions of behavior. The next slide represents an example of anecdotal record. This is a case study of pupil taking physical education. So let's move on to characteristics of proper anecdotal recording. First, it is a written down or was seen or heard. Inferences, guesses or assumptions are omitted unless they are labeled as inferences, guesses or assumptions. Then, second, the observer has determined what aspects of behavior are related to the dimensions being appraised. So, he observes this only and records this only. Third, if the record is to be cumulative, a plan of periodic observations and recording is established and adhered to. Fourth, words and phrases to be used are those with meanings which are clear and unequivocal. Fifth, words and phrases to be employed are those that are definable in terms things rather than other words. So it is concrete statements preferred to abstract ones. For example of these are, he became pale and his hands trembled, not he became disturbed. And sixth, words and phrases that have strong connotations are avoided. For example, love, courteous, loyal, dishonest. 7. Words and phrases to be avoided are those which expresses the observer's judgments or his opinions, and not just his perceptions. So, there are frequently encountered judgmental terms that should be avoided, and these are well-behaved, delicate, aggressive, didn't try, industrious, nervous, and happy.
Mechanical recording. It is a recording process wherein recorded signals embodied in the form of permanent mechanical set on a recording supported by cutting, embossing, and molding. If when we say recording, it comes to our mind, di ba, na it is something like audio, no? Recording. So, here are some of the mechanical aids available for recording. Examples is 1. Motion and still pictures. 2. Sound recording like tape or videotape. 3. A one-way vision, screen or minor. And next is an experiment or isolation cabinet for infant babies. Next is a photographic clone. Next is an endometer for an audio and applause meter. The use of mechanical devices in observation entails expenses, no? Mahal siya gamiton. So, but if the observer can afford, this assures that the observer has more accurate recording. So, if the observers can replay again and again, he can have a more detailed and more accurate observation of the different aspects of behaviors relatives to his objects. Stenographic recording. This is where observers want to record the aspects to be observed as fast as they occur. So this is usually seen in courtrooms. Like for example, na isa ka witness na mo testify sa unsay naibawan niya sa case. Then, ato na magamit ang stenographic recording para if unsay naibawaan sa witness, ma-record na dayon sa stenographic recording as fast as possible. This is good, especially in anecdotal recording because all the aspects to be observed and can be recorded. So, kaning anecdotal recording is something related to stenographic recording. But the difference between them is that anecdotal recording is a detailed descriptive narrative recorded after a specific behavior or an interaction occurs. However, transcription has to be as accurate as possible. Even though dakong tabang ang recording devices sa research, but lahi ra jud if observation kay makita jud mo in actual. So these are the ways on how to make an observation more valid and reliable. So first, use observation where and when data gathering devices cannot be used. 2. Use appropriate observation forms. 3. Record immediately. 4. Be as objective as possible. 5. Base evaluation on several observations. First, use observation where and when other data gathering devices cannot be used. This is how you can use observation to gather data. So, there are behavior activities where only observation can be used for collecting data. In this making of observation, may mga times nga kanang di magamit ang devices. but observation can big help, no? So, examples, school subjects as vocational education, such as physical education, running, music, singing, and dramatics, acting, and speech. So, in the farming, the farmers may be observed in actual work for some data. So, dili man jud pwede if imuharang videohan jud tibok nga anang gihimo sa farmers. So, adto ka mag-base sa observation. 2. Use appropriate observation forms. There are 3 examples of observation forms. First is checklist form. Then, second is rating scale. And the third one is anecdotal record. So, for checklist, if very objective ang data and are to be gathered, no? Second is the rating scale. If activities or things are to be evaluated or rated, the third one is anecdotal record. If the activity is a complex one and if it has to be observed in action. You can also use replayable mechanical devices for a more in-depth and accurate analysis. So, if dili ka sure adto sa checklist, well, magamit na lang ka og mechanical devices o gusto jud ka nga accurate and sure. 3. Record immediately. The purpose of recording immediately what have been observed is to ensure that the things observed are recorded accurately. If things observed and dili siya ma-record immediately, there might be a tendency that distortions may occur in their recording, and this makes the data gathered inaccurate and unreliable. So, may tabo nga inaccurate and unreliable ang inyong magather nga data. 4. Be as objective as possible. Record exactly what occurred and rate or evaluate the person or activity observed without bias or preconception. So, if unsa jud tong nahitabo, mao ra jud dapat i-record. So, again, there will be no bias and preconception. Number 5, base evaluation on several observations. The average of several measurements or trials is generally used as the basis for a conclusion. This should also be an observation. The average of several observations is admittedly more accurate, valid, and reliable than the result from an observation alone.